While money in politics continues to be a massive corrupting force in Congress, the truth is, equally egregious is their ability to invest in and trade individual stocks. Now, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked about whether this should even be allowed, and her answer was ridiculous. But before we get to her, I do want to give you some context into why this is a problem while also explaining a recent 5-month investigation that was done by Insider, just looking at whether or not members of the House are abiding by what's referred to as the Stock Act. It was legislation passed during the Obama administration, signed by Obama. And the whole point was to prevent insider trading by members of Congress while also ensuring that their conflicts of interest don't stand in the way of passing legislation that needs to be passed. Now, prior to the Stock Act, studies found that members of Congress had consistently outperformed the stock market, and they were very likely able to do so based on insider information. Remember, we're talking about individuals who have these classified briefings. They have private conversations in regard to possible legislation. They have information that ordinary Americans are not privy to. And that information can clearly help them make decisions that are lucrative in the market. Let's take a look.
And they have market moving information, and they're going to act on that information. I mean, information is king.
A groundbreaking 2004 study by a group of professors and researchers examined the records of U.S. senators between 1993 and 1998. The study found that a portfolio tracking the stocks that the U.S. senators bought during the same time period outperformed the market by 85 basis points each month, and a portfolio that tracked the stocks that the senators sold during the period lagged behind the market by 12 basis points. The study concluded that the senators knew appropriate times to both buy and sell their common stocks.
Now, that apparently did get some negative attention, almost to the point where the Obama administration decided that it needed to push for robust reforms. The only issue is they didn't end up passing robust reforms. They ended up passing something known as the Stock Act. Okay, so this is the insider trading bill that was meant to prevent lawmakers, both in the House and the Senate, from engaging in these conflicts of interest and also using insider information to trade various stocks. Now, Obama seemed to market this as if it was this incredibly powerful, robust regulation meant to hold members of Congress accountable while also forcing them to disclose their activity in the markets. Let's watch.
The Stock Act makes it clear that if members of Congress use non-public information to gain an unfair advantage in the market, then they are breaking the law. It creates new disclosure requirements and new measures of accountability and transparency for thousands of federal employees. That is a good and necessary thing.
It is a good and necessary thing, but really what matters are the details. What did this regulation, what did this law entitle the American people to, and what did it force members of Congress to do? Well, really, the strongest part of it was the disclosure component, although in order for it to be strong, it would need to be enforced. Now, lawmakers and their senior staff who earned at least $132,552 in 2021 would need to report or disclose any trades that they make in the stock market worth $1,000 or more. And they have to report it within 30 to 45 days of making those trades. But the legislation, likely intentionally, didn't have a strong enforcement mechanism in place. And so a recent 5-month investigation by Insider found that the reporting requirement has not been honored by members of Congress. Insider's investigation of financial disclosures found that 49 members of Congress and at least 182 of the highest paid Capitol Hill staffers were late in filing their stock trades during 2020 and 2021. Lawmakers and senior congressional staffers who blow past the deadlines established by the 2012 Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act are supposed to pay a late fee of $200 the first time. Increasingly higher fines follow if they continue to be late, potentially costing tens of thousands of dollars in extreme cases. Now, since they passed this legislation, they allegedly believed in this legislation, they're enforcing it, right? I mean, if the disclosures aren't happening, then there should be fines, there should be punishments, except that's not what's happening. According to Insider, no public records exist indicating whether these officials ever paid the fines. Congressional ethics staff wouldn't even confirm the existence of non-public ledgers tracking how many officials paid fines for violating the Stock Act. And Insider decided to reach out to these members of Congress to see if they would maybe provide proof that they paid fees or disclosed, their trades. Well, 19 of these lawmakers that Insider reached out to wouldn't answer a single question about whether they paid the penalty. And others were not really upfront. They declined. 10 other lawmakers, for instance, said that they did pay their fines, but they declined to provide any proof, such as a receipt or canceled check. All right, so now you have a little insight into what's really going on in regard to the Stock Act and whether it's being enforced. And so during a recent press conference, Nancy Pelosi was asked about this and also asked a follow-up question that I think is incredibly important. And it's also incredibly important to pay attention to how she answered it. Let's watch.
Madam Speaker, Insider just completed a 5-month investigation finding that 49 members of Congress and 182 senior congressional staffers have violated the Stock Act, the insider trading law. I'm wondering if you have any reaction to that, and secondly, should members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
No, I don't know to the second one. We have a responsibility to report in the stock. On the stock, but I'm not familiar with that 5-month review, but if people aren't reporting, they should be. Because this is a free market and we're a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that. Yes, ma'am.
We are a free market economy and we should be able to use the insider information that, most other people are not privy to inform our trades. It's a free market. Listen, I mean, even if the free market argument stood, it doesn't really make much sense, again, when you are using information that other people do not have access to. But look, the reaction from Nancy Pelosi is not in any way surprising, especially when you consider the fact that her own behavior in Congress is what inspired the Stock Act in the first place.
Pressure's been building after several academic studies revealed lawmakers play the markets better than anyone else.
Members of Congress outperform the stock market by about 6 to 10% on a regular basis. Now, that may be due to the infinite wisdom that resides in these halls, or it could be something different, luck, smart, savvy trading, or the possibility that there was insider knowledge.
Recent reports highlighted potential conflicts of interest. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, is alleged to have received beneficial treatment from credit card company Visa to buy its shares, as a controversial credit card bill was being discussed.
I mean, seems like she doesn't really care too much about the enforcement of the Stock Act. Seems like she wasn't necessarily even in favor of the Stock Act, considering she was part of the inspiration behind passing it in the first place. It's just incredible stuff, really. And to be sure, Nancy Pelosi isn't the only one who is benefiting handsomely from this insider information. Seems like her husband, Paul Pelosi, is also benefiting from it. In fact, a recent report in Forbes indicates that the week before the House Judiciary Committee voted on reining in big tech, Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband exercised a bullish bet on Google parent Alphabet in a timely transaction that netted him $5.3 million. Paul Pelosi, who bought 4,000 shares of Alphabet on June 18th, as revealed in a financial disclosure signed by Nancy Pelosi and filed on July 2nd, made an initial $4.8 million gain from Alphabet's rising share price and has since seen his gain grow to $5.3 million. Paul Pelosi also reported buying call options for Amazon, Apple, and Nvidia, but he did not report exercising them. So going back to Pelosi's video, where she says, well, I'm not familiar with that 5-month investigation, but if members of Congress and their spouses aren't reporting it, they absolutely should. Well, maybe Pelosi should take her husband aside, have a conversation about how he's not abiding by the Stock Act. I'm sure she's genuinely concerned about that. Now, I want to go back to the enforcement mechanism for the Stock Act because it really has no teeth. It's incredibly weak for a number of different reasons. So, for instance, Insider's report also includes some important details about why the enforcement mechanism is weak. For instance, the enforcement of the financial disclosure requirements is virtually non-existent, said a former investigative counsel in the House's Independent Office of Congressional Ethics, who was granted anonymity in order to speak candidly. Others say that the enforcement process is just too complicated and burdensome, and it seems like people keep passing the buck in regard to who's meant to enforce it. The former investigative counsel at the Office of Congressional Ethics described the late penalty compliance process on the House side as, quote, not the simplest thing in the world. The committee does not look for late filings. There is no notification or follow-up. I mean, seems like this is by design. Now, the person also continues to tell Insider that if you're late and beyond the grace period, meaning the grace period where you're meant to report your stock trades, you actually have to start making a bunch of calls to figure out how to pay the fine. The instructions aren't even on the ethics committee site. And then you have to walk the check down. Also, a senior congressional aide who also requested anonymity to candidly discuss House procedures confirmed that members did not get notifications when they were late in disclosing their stock activity. Instead, they explained, each member office was expected to figure out not only whether they were late, but also how to pay the late fee. This entirely depends on the honor system, the aide said. And listen, we've seen how self-regulation works in big companies and corporations. And that's just to say that it doesn't work. You can't rely on self-enforcement. And that's exactly what's happening here. Individuals in Congress who are not reporting their stock activity, who are not abiding by the very regulation that they pass themselves, are essentially the ones responsible to call themselves out, which is insane. And listen, the enforcement is a little better on the Senate side, but there are issues in the Senate as well, as we learned during the coronavirus pandemic when several senators were seen trading stocks after having a classified coronavirus briefing. Now, on the Senate side, one of the main problems is funding, because they have to allocate the funding necessary to enforce the Stock Act for the Senate.
The Stock Act is enforced by the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And where do they get their funding? They get their funding from Congress, which is the very body that they are supposed to be regulating. So the Stock Act is good, but I think we need to do a whole lot better.
And look, what we're also seeing on TikTok with financial advisors and even with other retail traders is, since they feel like they can't beat the corruption that we're seeing among members of Congress, they've decided to join them. For instance, Yahoo News reports that there are retail traders who are just simply following the disclosures offered by Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband. And if they're able to outperform the market based on insider information, why wouldn't retail traders do the same thing? It's a problem, right? It's a huge problem because it shows that there is a double standard in society. If an ordinary citizen, or even someone who's not that ordinary, someone like Martha Stewart, engages in insider trading, there are some serious consequences at play. When it comes to the Stock Act, which is meant to have some consequences, there's no talk about prison time. I mean, the only thing they need to do is, self-regulate by disclosing their stock activity, and then maybe they'll get slapped with a fine, maybe. But again, in the House, there's really no enforcement mechanism in place. What is in place seems to be a facade, just meant to seem as though they want they want to hold each other accountable, but that's not really what's happening. And why is this such a huge problem? Look, I don't really care as much about the insider trading. What I do care about is the double standard. And what I also care about is what this means in regard to the representation that ordinary Americans get from the people that they elect in these positions of power. These are people who are supposed to make decisions on regulation. These are people who are supposed to do what's best for their constituents. But it is impossible for them to do that when these conflicts of interest are at play. When you think about, for instance, our broken healthcare system, well, these lawmakers are very likely personally invested in the stocks associated with private insurers. And these are lucrative investments. Are these lawmakers going to be able to kind of, brush aside their own financial interests to do what's right for the American people? Look, there are maybe one or two principled lawmakers. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders is a prime example of a principled lawmaker who genuinely has an interest in representing his constituents and the American people. But with a few exceptions, what we're seeing time and time again is that these so-called public servants aren't really interested in serving you. They're interested in serving themselves. And what this system does is, of course, it creates corruption, but more importantly, it attracts the wrong people to Congress, right? Because if it's just out in the open that members of Congress can trade individual stocks, that they can do so based on insider information with impunity, well, are you going to have, decent congressional candidates run? Or is this going to attract people who have all the wrong incentives in place? So I think what we're seeing in government right now is not just a failure on behalf of the American people, but a failure of incentives, like putting the incentives in the wrong place, refusing to, do anything about these corrupting forces. And these corrupting forces always lead to bad decisions. We're seeing it right now, especially when it comes to the Build Back Better agenda, especially when it comes to social spending, and when it comes to something that we desperately need, like a Medicare for all healthcare program in the United States. And Nando is going to do his decode today on the Build Back Better agenda. And I don't know, like when you kind of take a step back, Nando, and you see where all the incentives are, I mean, it really makes a lot more sense. Like the fecklessness of Congress isn't necessarily fecklessness. I mean, some of it is, but I think a lot of it is about, I'm going to look out for my financial interests, and I'm not going to, take a privatized, broken healthcare system and make it something that's run by the government and public.
It's funny. I have some friends who work on Wall Street, and a while ago, they told me that there's a whole group of young kind of traders on Wall Street that all they do, or like a good chunk of what they do, is they just pick the same stocks that Pelosi's husband does. They just buy the same stocks that Pelosi's husband does. And like while you were doing the decode, I just like Googled it because I've heard that, and I Googled it and I found tons of stories about it, and one on Yahoo News. And it's crazy. It is like it says, though Nancy Pelosi herself doesn't trade stocks, her husband does, and that's enough for some social traders who see his trades as hers. Quote, we've been tracking their performance, and every single stock she has bought in the last 2 years has gone up significantly, Christopher Josephs, co-founder of Iris, said. And it's like, there's just these people who, like, they're just like, they know this. Everyone kind of knows this, that of course, if you're a member of Congress or married to a member of Congress, it's not just about the insider information. It's about, like, they can literally do legislation that might help their stocks.
Of course. Yeah.
And if they're not writing it themselves, like, they're around and they can like kind of hint it at people or whatever. Like they're literally writing the laws, which have massive effects on the stock price of individual companies. Like a law could destroy a company, or it could make a company, multiply in value, depending on what it is. And it's absolutely crazy that this is allowed, and that she just dismisses it as the most, of course, it's a free market. What are you talking about, you idiot?
Yeah.
And
like the entitlement that comes along with that, right? Because At this point, most members of Congress are so far removed from what their job is supposed to be that they forget that they're supposed to be public servants. And so for Nancy Pelosi, it's like, of course I'm going to use my position of power to make more money. Like, of course that's the point. Like, it's almost like she's incensed, like she's like befuddled by the question. Like, how dare you even suggest that members of Congress be banned from investing in individual stocks? But really, one final thing I'll say is it makes me realize not how useless, but like if we put all our eggs in the electoral politics basket, we're going to keep losing because every like, yes, there's money in politics, and that lobbying issue has been talked about over and over again. That is a problem. It exists, but it's not just about that. Like, it's just systemic corruption. It's baked into what these members of Congress do. So we can have election after election. We can hear candidate after candidate, telling us all the pretty little stories that we want to hear. But at the end of the day, if we as Americans don't have our own enforcement mechanism, if we're not organized, really the electoral politics ends up being, I don't want to say irrelevant. It is relevant to some extent. But the impact of electoral politics really is limited when you have, the situation we have right now with no labor power, very little labor power, and, no real movement in place to provide a real enforcement mechanism to ensure that ordinary Americans are represented.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.